Aside from the RTX 4090, there are two cards that compete against each other on the very top level. The RTX 4080 Super and the 7900 XTX, both of which just come under $1,000. So with both cards now out and reviewed, we thought we'd put them to test in 42 games to see exactly how they compare and, who comes out on top. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video's sponsor.
I'm never going to be an esports gamer. I never get any kills.
I wouldn't be so sure of that.
Is that Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com?
Yes, my son. It is me, Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com.
What are you doing here?
I'm here to bestow upon you a gift that will transform you into a true gamer. With a 24.5-inch Full HD screen, 240Hz refresh rate, 0.5 millisecond response time, AMD FreeSync Premium, and height adjustability, you'll be gaming in the big leagues in no time.
Oh, thank you.
No problem, my son. Why don't you check out the link in the description below to find out more.
So as always, I don't want to run over the specs because our day one launch coverage takes care of all of that. And with any of these head-to-heads where comparing an AMD card against an NVIDIA card in terms of specs, it doesn't really do any justice because they are both engineered in, very different ways. Like I said at the start though, aside from the RTX 4090, which is for the most part in a world of its own in terms of performance and pricing, the 7900 XTX from AMD and the RTX 4080 Super from NVIDIA are the most comparable high-end cards right now, with the NVIDIA card hitting the $999 price point, and AMD, thanks to some price cuts, is now available for $959. So the big question comes down to if NVIDIA is better, and by how much to warrant that extra $40 price injection. Well, that's what we're going to find out in 42 benchmarks at 3 different resolutions, so 126 single benchmark runs. To test, we threw the cards onto our GPU test bench with an AMD Ryzen 7 7800X3D on a Gigabyte B650E Aorus Master with 32GB of Corsair Vengeance RGB 6000MHz CL30 dual channel memory. All of our testing was done on Windows 11 with the latest updates applied and with the latest BIOS revision for the motherboard. The driver used was NVIDIA's 551.22 driver and AMD's 24.1.1 driver, and we tested in 42 games in total, of which we'll be focusing on about 15 today before jumping into the percentage difference of all 42 games. We'll be showing 1080p, 1440p and 4K results today, as these cards really are able to hit some pretty decent numbers. Though be warned, due to the high-end nature of these cards, 1080p and even 1440p to some degree will show some bottlenecks. We will also be looking at the cost per frame because that's really the crux of all of this. Which one is the better performer, and if the NVIDIA card warrants the extra price tag. Also, if you want to check out all the charts for all the games, they'll be available to our Patreon supporters, where you'll get access to a ton of other cool exclusive benefits as well. The link for that is, as always, down below. So, with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. So starting things off with a Plague Tale Requiem, where it's off to a good start for AMD as they actually come out on top at all 3 resolutions, and by some pretty decent margins. We're talking 9% at 1080p, 18% at 1440p, and a really impressive 45% lead at 4K, showing that the cheaper 7900 XTX really has the upper hand, but we'll see if that continues in other games too. In Baldur's Gate 3, the 7900 XTX falls behind at 1080p by a 3% margin, though this could be deemed as margin of error, along with some bottlenecks added into the mix. As we move up to 1440p, NVIDIA hold the lead as the 7900 XTX now falls 7% behind. And 4K, while NVIDIA still come out on top, it's only by a 3% margin, again falling into the realms of margin of error, and considering the extra cost involved, the AMD is still the better buy overall. In Call of Duty, AMD storm ahead by 18% at 1080p, though at such high frame rates it's nothing you'd ever notice, whereas the momentum keeps it up at the higher resolutions, where the 7900 XTX sits 15% ahead at 1440p, and a larger 21% ahead at 4K. With margins like this and the price disparity, the 7900 XTX is coming in strong, though we're yet to look at any ray tracing based tests yet. In Cyberpunk on the Ultra preset, we are seeing bottlenecks at both 1080 and 1440p, but the AMD card still comes out the stronger of the two, with a 3% lead at the lower resolution and a 6% gap at 1440p, though 4K improves upon that even more as the cards are now separated by 18%, again in favour to Team Red. Considering the game has been developed in conjunction with NVIDIA, this isn't looking good for Team Green. As expected, when we turn ray tracing on, NVIDIA manages to fight back in a very big way. At 1080p, we now see the 7900 XTX fall behind by a pretty sizable 33%, while both 1440 and 4K both see a similar 34% margin in favour to NVIDIA. Based on this one test, I think it's a telltale sign that AMD could be the king of rasterization, whereas NVIDIA are a force to be reckoned with in terms of ray tracing, as expected. As we move on to F123, we're seeing solid and high numbers across the board, with the higher numbers coming from AMD. At 1080p, the cheaper 7900 XTX manages to come out with 28% faster performance, and with much better 1% lows too. As we move up to 1440p, that gap widens now to 29%, again in favour of AMD, and 4K sees the flagship ahead, again by 28%. Playing devil's advocate though, the performance on both cards is well beyond anything that you'd notice, and you wouldn't be disappointed with anything in this title. As we enable ray tracing by moving up to the ultra high preset, things switch around as expected. NVIDIA are now holding the lead, but not by anywhere near the same margins. The leads are still good, with a 6% lead at 1080p, 8% at 1440 and 10% at 4K. But as we saw in the rasterization tests, AMD holds much stronger performance of closer to 30%. Moving on to Far Cry 6, and at 1080p, those pesky bottlenecks rear their ugly head yet again, as the RTX 4080 Super and 7900 XTX come within 1% of each other, so you can't really take much away from that result, other than that both GPUs are exceeding their potential. As we move up to 1440p, we start to see the GPUs part as AMD pushes ahead by 11% at 239 FPS, while 4K improves upon that further with 19% faster performance, again in favour of AMD. Then, as we enable ray tracing, again NVIDIA start to fight back, at least at 1080p, with the 7900 XTX now sitting 7% slower, but that's pretty much where the win starts and ends for Team Green, as 1440p has both cards essentially neck and neck, only separated by a margin of error 1%. 4K is the big one though, as AMD pushes ahead by 5%, taking their first ray tracing win over the big green giant. Next up is Hogwarts, and again in terms of pure rasterization, AMD takes a full house, with 19% more frames at 1080p, 27% more at 1440p, and hold an equally impressive 23% lead at 4K. At this point, it's really not looking great for NVIDIA in the pure rasterization tests, especially as the AMD 7900 XTX is the cheaper card of the two. As we enable ray tracing, in case you hadn't guessed it, the results get flipped on their heads, and NVIDIA are now the ones coming in stronger, which isn't surprising, as they themselves have said many times in terms of ray tracing that they are all in. And that shows with the 7900 XTX falling 13% behind at 1080p, a stronger 22% behind at 1440p, and an impressive 32% gap at 4K, all in favour of NVIDIA. Spider-Man is another title that has some pretty severe bottleneck issues, especially at 1080p and even 1440p, which does have AMD falling behind by a 3% and 6% margin respectively, but it doesn't really account for much in the grand scheme of things. 4K, however, is much more in line with where you'd expect performance to be, and that's still with NVIDIA ahead and AMD slipping behind by just 4%. Even with ray tracing enabled, there's still some pretty hefty limitations, but AMD still falls slightly short of the mark with a 6% deficit at 1080p, 5% less frames at 1440p, and then at 4K we see them slip 7% behind. Which, while they do lose in this one, it's not by anything substantial, and I'm not sure if it's just me, but I expected a little bit better from NVIDIA here. Ratchet and Clank is next up, and I've mentioned it time and time again that it really penalises NVIDIA-based GPUs in the lows, and isn't a mistake, so no need to adjust your screen. What we do find is a bit of a mixed bag, with AMD holding the lead by 6% at 1080p, while the gap shrinks still in favour to AMD by 3% at 1440p, whereas 4K sits almost identically with a margin of error result of AMD slipping 1% behind. As we enable ray tracing, the lows sort themselves out and NVIDIA takes the lead at all three resolutions, and by quite some large margins. At 1080p, AMD fall behind by 34%, whereas 1440p still has quite a big disparity, but now we're only talking around 29% slower for the 7900 XTX. Whereas 4K sees both cards drop below 60 FPS, but AMD falls harder, now sitting 31% behind the RTX 4080 Super. Lastly, in Starfield, AMD hold the stronger performance at 1080p with a 4% lead over Team Green, while that's the only real win for them in this title, as 1440p sees them falling a margin of error 1% behind, which equates to just 1 FPS, whereas 4K sees a larger but still margin of error difference of 3%, again with NVIDIA sitting just ahead. So from that small selection of games, it seems like the 7900 XTX is the wiser choice if playing rasterization based games, whereas NVIDIA is still the master of ray tracing. And while some will argue that's not good enough, I kind of get it. AMD have their focus on having strong performance in rasterization, while NVIDIA have their focus on being a strong contender in performance, but with a big push towards the future of visual quality through lighting. So you could argue that these are both very similar products in one way, but also very different in another. That's the reason NVIDIA have pushed so hard on ray tracing, and to combat the drops in performance, they have DLSS upscaling to bring things back in line. Though I'm not saying that's the only way to fix a problem, but AMD are of the same belief, even if they are some ways behind. Now, as mentioned, we actually tested the cards in 42 games, and as something of a request from our viewers recently, namely, the AMD fanboys, we're actually going to split things up in terms of rasterization and ray tracing differences. Now, when we look at 1080p in pure rasterization, so removing any ray tracing results, the 7900 XTX is the stronger of the two, with a 3% faster margin overall, which I guess could be argued as margin of error at such a small difference. And while the games are pretty evenly split, AMD does take the upper hand, and in some titles like Red Dead Redemption 2 and F1 23, it's by some pretty big margins, talking 31 and 28%, so much bigger than the gains that NVIDIA have in the likes of Tiny Tina's Wonderland and Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Though as we're only at 1080p, we are still seeing bottlenecks, even with our 7800X3D, so unless you're using a CPU like that, you may actually see worse limitations. As we move up to 1440p, there are still some CPU limitations in certain titles, but for the most part that has been eliminated, and that just further widens the gap, now with the 7900 XTX pushing 5% faster overall, with margins as great as 62% in Red Dead Redemption, though that is seen as an outlier, and removing it means that the 7900 XTX is only 3% faster overall. So again, we're in the realms of margin of error, and if gaming at 1440p, maybe with a higher refresh rate, you're not really going to notice the difference between the two cards, other than potentially, I guess, image quality changes, though that is, for the most part, subjective. Then at 4K, which is the big one where these two cards are aimed at, it's very much the same story. The AMD 7900 XTX comes in 8% faster overall, with some big wins in Red Dead Redemption 2 and A Plague Tale Requiem. But again, if we strip Red Dead Redemption 2 out, we're down to 6% faster margin. So above margin of error, but not much separating them. Though, as you take the 4% cheaper outlay in cost, that does actually help push AMD that little bit further as well. When moving over to ray tracing, as expected, NVIDIA come out with a full house, and the 7900 XTX now falls 18% slower than the RTX 4080 Super. This is nothing out of the ordinary and exactly what we thought would happen. And while there are only 12 games for this comparison, some of the gains are actually pretty sizable. 1440p again does well for NVIDIA, though AMD do fight back in Far Cry 6 as the margin slips to just 1% between them. Again, big gains by some of the most popular and newer titles on the market, like Alan Wake 2, where we see the AMD card coming in 22% slower, though some titles see wider gaps than that, like Cyberpunk, at a pretty large 34% slower for Team Red. 4K increases that lead even more, as the 7900 XTX now falls 19% slower when compared to the RTX 4080 Super. Again, AMD have something up their sleeve with Far Cry 6, as they actually managed to push ahead by 5%. And, well, that's really the only win for Team Red, as we're still seeing large variances of over 30% in the likes of Ratchet and Clank, Hogwarts, the Callisto Protocol, and of course, Cyberpunk. Though it is worth noting that some of these games saw, well, frankly unplayable frame rates at 4K with RT enabled, so upscaling is going to be your only saving grace here. But that's something NVIDIA typically would actually fare better in too. So I guess it's definitely something to take into consideration when you're looking at buying one of these cards. So performance within games to one side, there's always quite a big talking point in terms of power delivery and temperatures. And as both cards are reference models in a sense, it's always good to take a look at how they compare. Now, when looking at the total board power at 4K, which is typically where you're going to be using both of these cards, we find that NVIDIA clearly have the upper hand, as AMD uses a pretty sizable 48% more power across 19 games, which is, well, pretty bad overall, especially when you have the likes of Hogwarts Legacy using 482 watts of power, compared to NVIDIA's 301 watts. Clearly, NVIDIA is the more efficient of the two cards, and while that's the biggest margin we saw, it's still pretty wide between them in other games, like Assassin's Creed Valhalla using 422 watts compared to just 255 on the 4080 Super. So what I'm trying to say is, if you're worried about your electricity bill, of which many people across the world still are, you're going to spend more money running the AMD 7900 XTX in comparison in every single game. So what about temperatures? Well, luckily the huge variance in power draw doesn't always equate to huge jumps in the temperature, as we saw in a few games like A Plague Tale Requiem and Alan Wake 2 coming in identically in terms of heat output. But really, beyond that, while AMD picks up a win in Baldur's Gate 3, we're only talking by a single degree. Other than that, NVIDIA, as expected, does come in the cooler of the two cards, in some cases by up to 10 degrees, like in Far Cry 6. You could argue that NVIDIA have it right for power and efficiency, while AMD have just gone all out trying to push performance as far as they can, I guess really without too much care for the other areas that gamers look at. So what can we take away from this? I think it's clear to see that from the start we all knew which way this was going to go. And when we look at the full picture, the 7900 XTX is the overall winner due to its stellar rasterization performance. Of course, if we added in more ray tracing based tests, then it would lean more towards NVIDIA being the better card of the two. As it stands though, both cards are going to net you some great performance across all three resolutions, regardless. Though due to the, let's say, high-end nature, you are going to be limited at 1080p and then still somewhat limited at 1440p, as we saw in our testing. Of course, 4K performance is where you should be looking, but even then the 7900 XTX is the better of the two cards in terms of overall performance due to the amount of rasterization tests that we did. And of course in terms of value, as while it does come in the stronger of the two in performance, it's also the cheaper of the two cards by $40. But, and I want to say there's a big but, and I've made it clear in other content that we've done, the NVIDIA card is more expensive, but for very good reasons. When you look at the feature stack, the efficiency, and just the overall package, I mean, with ray tracing becoming more popular, CUDA acceleration for editing videos like we do, and upscaling through DLSS making large strides, that's where the extra cost goes. And as market share shows, gamers are actually happy to pay that extra money for those features. So there's what I feel to be a lot more behind kind of buying an NVIDIA GPU versus an AMD one. I don't want to sell AMD short though. Thanks to the price cuts that the 7900 XTX has seen, AMD are definitely being more aggressive in a hope to get more GPUs into gamers' hands. And for the most part, it is working. But with talk of AMD exiting the super high-end market for the next generation, I do wonder if the support will continue into the next couple of years if you buy something like the 7900 XTX. That's something that only time will tell. Beyond that, I think if you're looking at buying a GPU for around $1,000, then you can't go wrong with either of these two cards. And for the most part, it comes down to what games you play as to which one has the upper hand specifically for you. And if you need those extra features where NVIDIA managed to beat AMD. Or if you want something maybe a bit more rounded in general rasterization based games, which is where AMD have NVIDIA's number. For now, yeah, it's a tricky one, but that is going to do it for this one. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, then you can help support us over on Patreon, where you'll get a ton of exclusive benefits, including access to the individual charts for all the games we tested and not just the percentage differences, a super special area over on our Discord, bi-weekly game nights, meetups at the eTeknix offices, live streams, Q&As, and much, much more. The link is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.